Okay, so you were talking about Eric Vogelin.
Yes, he has a one of his volumes in his collected works is called Modernity Without Constraint. It has 3 books in one. I just read the first one. And already, I think in 1952, he writes about gnostic politics or political religions. And so these are political movements that really believe that they have access to knowledge,
Right.
and that gives them a superior position. And then they also believe in the struggle, because that's what Gnosticism usually is understood as this dualistic vision of the world where you have 2 principles that manage the world rather than one, right? So
Right.
normally, like in the Catholic religion, evil is a lack. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there is Satan, there is the devil, but he's like a minor, he's a fallen angel. He's a
Right.
minor figure. And then you have like Pelagianism. I don't know if you're familiar with that. So that Pelagius was I think a 5th century heretic, who fought with Augustine around original sin. And he said
Mm.
there's no original sin. So we're not. So evil is like more like making mistakes, not knowing the truth. But in Gnosticism, in Manichaeism, it's really like you have a real God
Right.
who lives in a perfect world where nothing ever changes. And then eventually there's a demiurge, which is an evil God,
Demiurge. Yeah.
right? Demiurge, which
Yep.
creates the fallen world. And so Jehovah is a false God, is an evil God because created this bad world.
Right.
And
Right.
anyway, and that is then
Well, it could be
transposed.
either evil or it could be simply just purgatory. Like it could be either. So, like in some traditions, the demiurge is like Satan. And in some traditions, the
Yeah,
demiurge is basically like the jail keeper, which is more of a purgatorial figure. You know.
right. But
Yeah.
okay, so purgatory, is interesting because it offers you redemption, right?
Right.
So you can actually get out of evil through to a process of purging.
Right.
But in the absolute dualisms, there's
Right.
you're not.
The
And they
darkest
would even
version. What? Yeah. Exactly.
yeah,
Especially
they would
dead.
even argue that not every human being
Right.
has what they call the divine spark
Right.
to actually go to the other dimension. So you're really stuck in evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would argue, for example, that if you do good here, well, the only thing you do is creating evil somewhere else, because this is the place of good and evil. You can't get out of it. So it's like a
Right.
balance, like the yin and the yang is one of the ways that they
Right.
interpret the Chinese Taoist idea. And it's very profound because then right? You have access to the operating system,
Right.
and the other people
And
are
it's zero sum.
by definition they're in a lower stage, lower stage of vibration,
Right.
or
Right. Right.
products of an evil god. And when you transpose that to politics, you get things like Nazi anti-Semitism, and the
Mm-hmm.
war of Stalin against the kulaks, where you because and that's what wokeism is about.
Well,
They've theorized
yeah.
standpoint epistemology in a way that they have kaleidoscopic consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
They know all the sufferings. The more intersectional you are, the more you know the sufferings. And at the top of the pyramid of evil, the white male cis whatever,
Right.
like we don't know anything,
Right.
and therefore be quiet and listen. And they created the epistemological hierarchy.
Well, it's very similar to the
Yeah,
Maoist revolution and the idea that basically in the Maoist revolution, the traditionalist order was blind. Anyone who basically worked for it in any way, shape, or form
yeah,
could not see the revolution
yeah,
because it wasn't for them. And
yeah,
so
yeah,
basically, like the white man is the new
yeah, yeah, yeah,
version of the same thing. We're blind, we can't
yeah,
see it no matter what, we're tainted. And it leads to a final solution, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a final
Very
solution
dangerous because
philosophy.
it's a
Yeah.
scapegoating mechanism. And so,
It's
it
exactly like
it
Nazism. It's final solution. It has to escalate towards a final
it
solution. So
dehumanizes. That's what most people
yes,
don't understand.
right.
They minimize cancel culture, but it's already so aggressive
Hmm.
and mean-spirited,
Right,
you know, in cancel culture, and that's just the beginning.
right.
That's just the beginning. Anyway, that's
Well, the greater the okay, all of that comes from existential issues. And so the greater your belief that an existential issue is solvable,
yeah,
the more likely it is that you're going to work aggressively to solve it. And so the major existential issues change based on generations in terms of how they frame them or phrase them. And
yeah,
that's
yeah,
part of that generational power, is that ability for the youth to always reframe the existential
yeah.
issues and just say, we have true knowledge of our world. You older people do not
Yeah,
have.
you don't understand it. Yeah, yeah.
No,
I get that, even before woke, but people would say, but you don't understand, you're old.
right.
And you know, my generation did the same. Like
Mm-hmm.
in 68, we said things like never trust anybody above 30,
Yes.
right?
Creepy
So
now when you think about it. It's creepy.
yeah, it's very creepy. Of course, you don't realize it
Yeah.
at that time. And I see how you treat. Of course, you could say, I'm defending myself, but really, how you treat elders for me is a signpost of civilization.
Yes.
So a culture where you're condemned from being old, I don't see that as any type of progress. I see that as kind of a barbaric impulse.
Well, it's a
Is
symbol. It's
Yeah,
very deeply symbolic. It basically says your your personality, your character as an older generation
yeah,
is the problem, that like the boomers or something like that.
right,
It becomes
yeah,
the intergenerational scapegoat, where basically you
yeah,
say,
yeah.
look,
I'm luckily I'm a bit I'm just a bit late to be a boomer.
well, this is a
So
lot of
I
what.
don't feel concerned. But yeah,
Well, yeah, you're more like early Gen X.
I
Uh,
guess, I guess.
yeah,
But
but
it doesn't make much sense because if I look at my youth, right? So I was 10 in 68, but I was premature. So I got a lot of it as a formative ideology anyways. And so 68 was a defeat.
Mhm.
That's very important. Like we had super, super high dreams and nothing came of it. And so the 70s,
It's where postmodernism came from, was the
yeah,
defeat of the
exactly.
revolution. Yes, it
Yeah.
was
So the
very kind of
leftists who were
final.
defeated, found a job,
Yeah.
found a job. And sometimes I used to say a bit jokingly, but I think there's a big truth behind it. The three ruling classes, right? The neoliberal business class, the financiers, the social democratic politicians who keep the social peace, and the postmodern academics who are in charge of demoralizing us.
Mhm.
uh, and it was an ideology defeat. So in the 70s, we were like in a therapeutic mode, dealing with our defeat. So a lot of people like me, we said, politics doesn't work. If I can't change the world outside and I'm not happy, then the only solution is to go inside and change so that I can be
Yeah.
happy in the world that as it really exists.
Mhm. And
And
Adam
then what
Curtis
happened in the
talked about
80s?
that, yeah, in Century of the Self, the
Yeah, yeah,
documentary. Yeah, which basically
yeah,
the century of the narcissism that emerged out of that was basically the counterforce to the theory of the internal enlightenment,
yeah.
internal consciousness.
Yes. And
Yeah.
then so what happened in the 80s, you shouldn't forget that because that was really real. And you had to be there to experience it. But in the 80s, we already had a generation of young people were more conservative than their teachers. So that
Mm-hmm.
was the Reagan Revolution. It was,
Mm-hmm.
and I think these people are already reacting to the excesses of '68.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I saw that in Occupy when I was in New York. At what's the park again? You know what I mean, right?
Uh,
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 Zuccotti Park, I think, or
mm,
something like, yeah. So um, I I went to a school that was like 500 meters away because I was staying with people, and this was like young working class people,
right.
and they couldn't, and there were migrant generations. They couldn't stand Occupy already, right? Because of the kind of class thing, the uh, Zuccotti Park being like the knowledge class, the young cognitive urbanites, and the technical school that was like working class, and that was already like reactive to Occupy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, anyway, I forgot my thread, but what I wanted to say is that it's never like just a generation.
Right.
There's divisions in generations. There's people going different ways, and I think you can analyze it in some subtle way, like the fourth generation book.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how right they are, but I think that's legitimate as far as it goes, whether it's right or wrong. But to actually frame politics as a generation war is, I think, not very interesting.
This is so. This is basically where, for a lot of people, the Bernie Sanders campaign fell apart. So some of what happened was a generational split around what the message of the Bernie Sanders campaign was really about. And
Right.
so Bernie was trying to keep together this paleo left, the manufacturing socialism, the left of good jobs for everybody at a standard
Right.
wage, that accessible jobs, and so basically he was trying to create government job guarantees.
Yeah.
And obviously the implications of this is deglobalization, right? And a lot of the argument for why this works is because you'd say, well, a big part of environmental impact is the shipping all around the world and this global trade. And if we deglobalize, then we can kill two birds with one stone. We can actually reduce our environmental footprint while also
And reindustrialize,
right,
recreate jobs. By the way, I also believe that myself. We
right,
might disagree on this, but I do believe
right.
that there is like a rationale there.
Right. So one of the major problems with this is that uh, the level of economic development between different countries is a problem. So basically, it's the whole, well, the rich countries are going to take their ball and go home, and they're going to abandon the developing world, who is relying on every penny they can get in terms of international investment to stay afloat. And if we were to pull back, almost instantly, we would have to either bail out other countries or we would have to abandon them to whatever
Yeah,
fate. Because,
I'll give you a slightly
and
different
look at
interpretation.
Afghanistan,
Yeah.
is that's my point. Look at Afghanistan. When you pull out of a developing area, you have to have an exit strategy, or else what you're basically saying is
Yeah,
you're
it's going to implode. Yeah, and okay,
yeah,
I get that, and
yeah.
I think that is true. But I share
It's
this essay by
complicated.
I I share this essay by Earl Thompson, and he starts in 1820. He says until that time, 90% of world population was at subsistence levels,
Right,
and the lifestyle of a French farmer in 1790 was not fundamentally different than an Indian farmer in 1250
right,
or a Mesopotamian farmer, 1,000 years earlier.
right.
But then you have the Napoleonic Wars,
Hmm.
and so what Napoleon does is he redirects and canalizes revolutionary energy in, in patriotism.
Hmm.
Uh, and he was the first to be able to massively produce guns so that every citizen of France could be armed.
Hmm.
And so he mobilizes 3 million people in battle, whereas the old aristocracies can only maintain 300,000 people. And that's why he sweeps over Europe,
Hmm.
because he just has this technological superiority and this new form of thinking and organizing. And so eventually they adapt to this and they coalesce and they defeat him, but at such a cost. This is the argument of Earl Thompson, that they decide that they can't have war in Europe. And except for 1871, a very short Franco-Prussian war,
Right.
there are no internal wars in Europe until 1914.
Yeah. And there's a big connection between that and the Victorian age. The idea that basically the Victorian morality, the
Yeah,
internal guilt society, the basically the shaming society, the guilt society.
yeah,
And so another parallel is that Augustus Caesar, um, after conquest, he wanted to establish a period of stability. And during the period of stability, he put through a lot of moral codes where he
right.
basically cleaned up the brothels, and he gave money to women who were virtuous, and
Right, this
he.
is exactly the Victorian period. And so what you have is a fivefold increase of wages
Mhm.
of the working class. And his argument is because the European countries had to compete for work, and the workers could also go to Australia, to the US, to Canada. And so that creates, this kind of very long social democratic phase, if you
Right.
like, or pre-social democratic phase. But they clean up the cities, hygiene, better working conditions.
Right.
Bismarck, introduces social security and all of that.
Mhm.
Um, but here's what happens. So then 1914, 1917, so you get fascism, communism, and democratic capitalism competing with each other. Fascism
All
is
of them
defeated.
eugenic, though. This is the key. They were all
Say that again.
eugenic.
Oh yeah, there were
Eugenics.
all of them.
They were
Absolutely.
all eugenic, and that's
Yeah.
key because that helps to explain why it had to collapse. That basically, coming out of the Victorian age, so we had this liberal society in England, liberal, the
Yeah.
Dickinson period, the Charles
Yeah.
Dickens period. Okay, where basically liberality during that period also meant abandonment. It basically
Yeah.
meant that some people had different starting places than others.
The
And
average
yeah,
life expectancy of a working class person in Liverpool until like 1848
uh-huh,
is 31 or
yeah,
33.
worked to death, literally.
But by
Yeah,
1890, you have situation where there's zero crime, almost zero crime
right.
in London. The air is cleaned up. Um, but so let me
But oh,
continue. So
wait. Let me
80,
wait. Hold on a
yeah,
second. Let me make the eugenics point. And so what happened is that under this environment of brutal liberal competition, excessively liberal competition, there was a hidden social class system still that charged fees and was gatekeepers. You still had guilds. You still had
yeah,
immigrants had different access to the ability to markets to sell their wares and things like this. They did lots of hidden things to kind of rig the system. And then the public explanation for why the system was rigged was genetic. So because as
yeah,
Darwinism came along during that period, they kept saying, well, look, everything's fair and open. The only reason why these people are winning and these are losing is because they're
right,
imbeciles or they're weaker races or something of that
right,
nature. While there was a hidden system of exclusionary behavior
right,
underneath that liberal shell. So
yeah,
liberalism never really happened quite because just like in the modern liberal neoliberalism, there's a
yeah, yeah,
hidden shell of
Yeah, that's
institutional and
that's Polanyi also, right? Polanyi talks
right,
about this, about the lib-lab
right,
polarities,
right.
where then you have excesses under liberalism, which then creates
Hmm.
a revolt, and then the
Right,
polarity changes.
right.
But let me just finish
Going,
the
sure,
reasoning overall, Thompson, because it's very interesting,
sure.
and it's I'm still answering your argument from in the beginning about
Generations.
relocalization and stuff, right?
Oh, okay.
So once the Soviet Union collapses, there is no more competition, and this is what the neoliberal approach does. It forbids the global South to protect its own economies. And if you look at
Mm-hmm.
Hajun Zhang, right,
Mm-hmm.
he says there's never been any country which developed without protectionism.
It's true.
It's a very,
Frederick
very
List.
strong.
Frederick List. He did a massive
Yeah.
study, and he proved that basically all rapidly developing countries had some form of state
Yeah. And then you see
infrastructural
Korea
program
and
combined
Taiwan,
with protectionism.
So US in
Yeah.
the 19th century, the UK in the late 18th, but then Japan,
Rome,
Korea, Taiwan, right?
Byzantine,
But
like
Latin America and Africa couldn't do this, right? Because the new regime, the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal regime, forbids them to do any protectionist policy, and so that creates a situation where they provide cheap labor. The EMF imposes a defunding of the social funding, but a funding of the middle class, right? And then what you get is you get a permanent brain drain. And if you look at Africa and Latin America, they have not been doing well, overall under the neoliberal regime. It's
institutions
some
aren't being
African countries
built
are doing
fast
well
enough.
now, only now,
Right.
right? But Argentina was much richer in the 1930s than it is today.
Absolutely. And
It was, and Uruguay was
institutional
called the
that
Switzerland of.
it has institutional problems. So basically, they don't have a functioning financial system like they used to. They don't
Yeah,
have
but that's because they are neo-colonialized, right?
right.
So that would be
Well,
my answer to your argument, is that there are ways to reindustrialize that are not, it's not like 100% protectionism or 100% neoliberalism. There's kind of,
right.
So you could, for example, in my view, that would totally be legitimate to have ecological taxes that, so that if you buy something from China, the whole, the chain of ecological damage is just calculated in the price, right? And that would kill, and you don't have to go from 0 to 100. You can do that.
I think the economic fixes are easier than the cultural, though. I really do. I think that it's much easier to explain them. And these days, when I get into arguments with people, they rarely bring up the economics. So basically, what they assume is, people assume that if we could agree on a path, that we know what the economic tools are to use, but we have to agree on the path, because the middle doesn't work. So the argument is that if we were to go this way or that way, we know what tools to use. But if we stay where we are, those tools are conflicting. They did. So basically, it's like you can't go. People
I think that's
believe we can either go
partially.
very liberal, very open, very global,
Yeah.
or we could go very protectionist. Now, what you and I have talked about a lot is cosmolocalism, which is basically a way to try to resolve that paradox, which is like we can either be very open or very closed as an economic system. But in this moderate stage, we're getting what we're getting, because we've been running a moderate economy for a long time, where we do an integrated balance of open and closed economic strategies.
Right.
And the thing is that there's only two kinds of integrated economies. There's basically the West would be the liberal integrated economies, which we call LMEs in technical terms, which is like liberal market economies like England, Canada, it's the Commonwealth countries, the United States, so forth. And then you have the coordinateds, which is like Italy, Germany, and so, and the coordinateds to this day are still using what you would call a kind of fascist light, where basically our corporate boards of directors, in the United States, you have the board of directors and you have no real government participation in them. But in Germany, you have government participation in the boards of major companies. You also have dual level boards and things of that nature.
We have that in Belgium, where I come from. We have that as well. And yeah, I'm sympathetic to that kind of,
coordinated economy. Where it's basically,
it's a compromise, because the problem for me in the US is, as compared to China. So I see China as a collective ruling class. Right, I don't call it socialist or communist. That doesn't really work anymore. But the fact is, 70% of their economy is state-owned or state-controlled, not in a purely central manner. But the Communist Party is everywhere. Every company has to have a representation, and so they can set rules and limits. Right, so there is a strategic plan. 5, 10, 25 years. There is a strategic plan. And for example, if there is too much gentrification or house speculation, they just cut it. They just tell the banks, in that locality, stop lending. The real estate collapses and working class people can buy houses again, and then they relax the rules again, right?
The one thing they don't tell you, though, is
Chinese are doing that all the time.
There are losers, though. It's not all win-win. They try to create the illusion that every strategic plan of the Chinese Central Planning Organization creates a win-win for all Chinese citizens. That's the illusion they're trying to create. But there is a win-lose proposition in many of these things. Like in Shenzhen, there are losers. Not everybody wins. But the thing is that in that society, there's such a strong shame of being the loser that they basically won't allow it to be printed. It still happens. Nobody's allowed to talk about it.
The thing what I want to say is that, it's a Polanyian argument, right? It's about disembedded, embedded markets. Is that as market-oriented as it is, as capitalism, that it is, the market remains embedded in a control mechanism, which is the state. And the state is run by, a communist party, right, which has millions of people.
Well, and
millions of members.
And what you said about communism, so it's not even so important that it's the Communist Party. It says it's the nation of China. So basically, the Chinese have had an official national history. Not every country on earth has an official national history. And once you have an official national history, it means somebody gets to write the history and say, this is Chinese history. This is how we plan the future. This is how we wrote the past. And so China had a continuous national history up until the Communist Party broke that continuity. However, just because they changed history doesn't mean it was discontinuous in any real sense, because the party apparatus continues to nationalize the history. Right.
And, they were the first civilization that created the Mandarin class, which run the country. And which was based on, recruiting throughout the land, right? The 2% brightest kids were recruited in the Mandarin system, and so that kind of controlled situation that created the Chinese empires, is in a way you could argue it's a new form of it, right? It's a new form. It's not the same, but it's profoundly linked to previous periods of the Chinese history.
But I want to stress this national history issue, because if you're woke, you're trying to create a new international history. Okay, so the socialist movement in the 19th and 20th century was largely about creating a new history, or to say history was written by aristocrats, history was written by the
Right.
Pope, history was written by these institutions. And
Right.
they were accusing Western civilization as being captured by a formal historical process, in the same way as China, where basically it was like, the elites own history and they've written it for us.
Yeah.
And so basically what we need to do is rescue history from itself and to create a new international history that is enlightened.
Yeah.
And so what basically woke is a return to that without some of the, how shall I say, the materialist features of the old
Yeah.
socialism.
Yeah. I mean, it's way more
The
problematic
cultural
because I
history.
mean, I think personally that socialism,
Mhm.
and working class consciousness was an attempt to create a world-centric consciousness.
Yeah.
All the producers, get their own value, and I mean, idealistically, kind of like a global empire, of the workers, right?
Right.
Just as before you had the Christianity and Buddhism, right? And so they became the religion of an empire with
Right.
universalist applications. So the difference between royalty and
Mm-hmm.
empire is that it's not nationalistic. Like an
Mm-hmm.
emperor is for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
and they basically want to control the whole world, as they see it in their time. That's why, for example, Genghis Khan, completely wiped out Baghdad because it
Mm-hmm.
was a rival empire. There can be no rival empire
That's right.
anyway. And so that's basically
That goes back to
religion
the
and
magisteria
Marxism
conversation. So the
are.
magist,
Yeah, but I see
you know,
wokeism as in a completely different way because it's a force of fragmentation. It's I think wokeism is the opposite. It's
it doesn't build.
if you're not in any traditional environment, right,
Mm-hmm.
where you can. So now there is a revival in Europe of what's called souverainisme in French. So people want to revive their nation state,
Mm-hmm.
and of course it's not majoritarian, but it's pretty strong. It's like 20,
Mm-hmm.
30% of the voting public, and it could be stronger. And it has already won in Hungary, in Poland,
Right.
in Denmark. Yeah.
Strengthening of the national identity or the
Yeah.
local identity.
A
Yeah.
renewal of the nation identity. So limit migration, force assimilation, finished with multiculturalism. And my argument here is that this is actually more inclusive than wokeism, because anybody can be a citizen. I can assure you that a right-wing nationalist person today is not racist. I mean, there are some, but in general, if they would find a black conservative, they'd be so happy, right?
Right. Right.
It's about social order and
Right.
about a particular form of community. And I think that the woke are those that are completely rootless. So they cannot, the imaginary doesn't work with the nation. And I can understand them. I was that way when I was young. I didn't believe in the state. I didn't believe in university. I didn't believe in schooling. I blamed my parents. There was a lot of anomie, in
Right.
our Western society.
Right.
Okay, I found a way in Marxism that was because I was a working class kid, and that still worked. By going back to this kind of social consciousness, I rebooted my identity.
Yeah.
But the woke, they're completely rootless, and so what's left for them is really my skin color, my sexuality, um, and that's not an identity.
No.
I'm really sorry,
It's
but that's not an
no.
identity.
It's
That's
an
like,
anti-identity.
yeah, because
It's
in a nation you have to make an effort, right, in order to unify with people from other regions, other religions. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of integration.
Well,
And for
as I
me,
said,
and that is,
critique is not construction. So
yeah,
when
yeah,
people say,
absolutely.
okay, the world is socially constructed, I'm saying, yes, it is constructed, which means it is built. And that means it is
Right.
built to, it has a foundation, it has a purpose, it has function, it has responsibility, it has all these things that it has to take on. And critique is how you
Yeah.
break down old constructions. It's not how you build. And so
Yeah, I completely agree. And that is what
when you use a
postmodernism
method of
was.
critique as your method of construction, you know you're screwed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And there's nothing else. There's
Right.
it's a parasitical, because what they want, if you read Kendi, page 19 of his book, it's all about, so any difference must be discrimination. Therefore, in order to restore what they call equity, the outcome of everybody has to be the same. And so that's going to happen through group allocation, right? So everybody's reduced to their group. And then you get whatever whatever you get is the right percentage point
Right.
of the resource, and that is managed by very powerful commissions.
Right.
That's his proposal.
This
But
devolves
let
into
me tell you this. Let me
tribalism.
tell you this.
This
This is
devolves into
entirely
tribalism.
parasitical,
Yeah.
right? It can work in an institution which is already rich. But for example, in a peer-to-peer community, I cannot give you anything just because you have glasses, or I mean, like, I cannot give you anything just because of some descriptive uh, aspect of your personality. I have to, you have to be a contributor to the system. By definition, you have to be constructive,
Right.
right? And open source and peer production are very meritocratic. In
Yes.
my opinion, too meritocratic, because it
At
only works
times,
for people
yes.
who have the skills, and
That's
if you don't
right.
have skills, there's no place for you.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying this is the perfect answer to everything, but the opposite, saying, like, just give us because we have certain characteristics, that's not a constructive ideology. That's an ideology of clientelism,
Mm-hmm.
and say whatever is already there, you redistribute it in a particular fashion, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's purely redistributive. It doesn't think about the production, like how it's well created. And that's why Marxists would actually critique woke by saying it's actually neoliberal. So what they are saying, Vivek Chibber and Tui Reed, these people are saying is they want equality in the inequality. As long as women and blacks and handicap and whatever they call now, I'm not sure, so as long as they get their fair share, we don't care about the overall distribution of wealth. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. Well, yeah. Of course,
You
it's
you
not.
have to have the CEOs have to be diverse.
Well, this is why wokeism was more popular with Hillary Clinton, but then it was with Bernie Sanders in their campaign, in 2016.
That's how they
So
destroyed him. That's how they destroyed him. I
exactly.
mean, yeah, in the primary in Georgia, they mobilized the black political class
Mhm.
with the narrative that Bernie was a white guy.
Well, look, I'm in Georgia right now, and
Yeah,
so I hang out at a place called Manuel's Tavern. Manuel's Tavern is a world famous place. It's where the civil rights movement was organized in Atlanta, and
right.
so Martin Luther King Jr.'s house is like half a mile away. I could walk to Martin Luther King Jr.'s house. It's a long walk, but I could walk there from where I am right now.
Right.
And Manuel's Tavern was the place where Jimmy Carter got started and everything. So basically, it was the informal meeting place for the Democratic Party machine. And so it was, but the party machine there was the localists and the civil rights activists, not the national machine. It was different. There was they weren't in alignment originally. And so the thing
Yeah.
is, like, this is a place that's been famous for like very subtle social movements over the years.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that it's definitely closer to being Clinton and Biden territory than it is to being Sanders territory.
Yeah.
And part of that is because Atlanta has a very large black middle class compared to most other places.
So
And
my
they are very
analysis,
pro-business. They're very pro-business.
my analysis comes from Vivek Chiber, who is the editor-in-chief of Catalyst, which is the theory magazine next to Jacobin.
Yes.
And he says that identity politics is there to stay precisely because of this.
Yeah.
So you have, what they call PMC, professional middle classes. And the Democratic Party now depends entirely on the suburbs. And that's the class which is sympathetic to, the broad ideas around identity politics. Because it's a way to diversify
American
institutional
politics,
levels, right?
American politics is split three ways. The hard left is the urban core, and the right is the rural space, and the suburbs is the battle over the center left and the center right. Okay.
Right.
And so basically, and it's extremely stark. It's not like even, it's the strongest correlation that we have between any variable and our political distribution is how far from the city core. And this is not, this is the Western history. It basically, and so much of what we call political is geopolitical. And so much of geopolitics is basically, well, from where I'm standing, this is the rational decision to make. If you're standing in the city core, you're right on top of lots of other people, and you can really understand the socialist perspective because you live it day to day. You want to be safe on the subway, and you want to be, all that sort of thing. If you live in the rural spaces, it's rather obvious why you prefer to have guns, because you have no police and, things of that nature. So these are very rational lifestyles depending on where you live. And if you're in the suburbs, as you just pointed out, you are in the middle class, you're in the office class. Like 80% of the people who live in those places are the office class, and they can't be directly against their own careers, but what they can do is to do their part, is to do petitions for the environment online. Here's my $25, here's my petition for the environment. And
they're liberal on political
and then I'll fight
issues
for my minority friends in the workplace because that's the only power I have.
But so politically, what that's my analysis is that you have the left was the party of the industrial workers and has moved to become the party of the cognitive urban classes.
Yeah. Because there are no industrial workers in the urban core anymore. That's why.
And it has radicalized in the sense of culture.
Yeah.
So the left has followed the right on economics, becoming more and more neoliberal itself. But, for example, there's an analysis that shows that Obama was to the right of Bush.
Mm-hmm.
But by that time, the Republicans were already so much more to the market libertarian ideas that, they were still progressive in that sense, right? So the left follows the right on economics slowly, but with like a 20-year delay.
Mm.
And the right follows the left on cultural issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what you have today is you have, and I'm very serious about it because I listen to these people now, is they accept the whole set of civil rights. There's like very few people who are conservative who are now against, equal marriage rights.
That's right.
There's some, in the evangelical communities, but in general, they've accepted, there where the left was, let's say in the late 90s.
That's right.
Right. And the left, meanwhile, has completely identified with the threats.
Well, so where that came from was Kimberly Crenshaw and her friends in the 1980s said, mission is not accomplished, right? So in the
Right.
70s, we had the Cultural Revolution and feminists and civil rights acts and so forth. And it's almost the instant that all of those laws were passed, the left had to say, not good enough, not even
Right.
nearly good enough, because, and so in their analysis, it was less than 10 years since the signing of many of these important acts.
Yeah.
The left was saying, we are still in crisis. Equality under the law is not good enough. We need reparations. We need all these more aggressive measures. We need the money. We can't just distribute social aid equally. We need to shift it all to the Black neighborhoods and to the minority neighborhoods. Otherwise, you're not fully repairing the system. And so this is where the third way people came in, and the third way people said, you know what? I can't give you the money through the government. Bill Clinton, he's like, I can't, I tried, when Bill Clinton was campaigning, he was campaigning for universal health care and all this other stuff, but he was telling, Black minority neighborhoods and minority politicians that he was going to make them special. They were saying that. You're special, just wait. As soon as I get into power, we're going to do things specially for you. Now, when they got there, they said, well, we don't have the budget. We can't do it through government. And so Hillary actually was part of the genius behind this. Hillary basically said, we can do it through business. And what we're going to do is, if we don't have the budget, what we can do is we can use regulatory measures to redistribute power that don't cost money, or at least they won't cost us. And so the government doesn't have to raise taxes to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with business leaders, and we're going to work with communities, and we're going to steer the regulatory ship. We're going to call it equal, but we're going to rig it the other direction. Okay. So the public speech is equality, equality, but the private agreement was, we know that we are rigging things a new direction now, and that is anybody who didn't have historical power, if they're not white male, whatever, they do get advantages. We just don't talk about it.
But what is happening now is that the middle classes are being promoted at the cost of the working classes of every kind.
Yes.
So you have like defunding the police.
It's
if you're in a high crime neighborhood, this is a very bad thing for you.
Yes.
And that's where the poor people live.
Yeah, it's great. So that's exactly what's going on in Atlanta. So like, if you live in a middle class neighborhood in Atlanta, it doesn't matter what color your skin is. We've got very low crime, and we've got community policing, and the community policing can work there because it's not too dangerous for them. If all you're doing is keeping a flashlight out for drunks at 2 a.m., and you're like, oh, well, there's a drunk person, send him home. Big deal. But if you go into the lower class side of Atlanta, it's run by gangs. You have over 2,000 active gang members in the city limits out of 450,000 people. And that's just in the limits of the city. There's far more than that. And these gangs are internationally connected through the Atlanta airport, which is the #1 busiest airport in the world. And they have a permanent stranglehold on these neighborhoods because they're mafias. They're rich. They have a lot of money. And so they run the shitty dangerous areas, and they make it so that if you defund the police, what do? You empower the gangs. You make them stronger. They become the de facto police. They already are. They run their city blocks. And so, so why would you argue to defund the police there unless you were on the side of the mafia? And this is what's been going on in the public media in the United States for many, many years, is that the music industry and the entertainment industry has said, you know what? We're pro-mafia. Most of the pop stars in the United States are generated through mafia-related funds. Okay. All these hippie festivals and consciousness festivals, they lose money. They are operated at a loss, and they end up profiting off of drug sales through the criminal organizations that basically secretly run these festival scenes. And so basically the criminal organizations skim off all the profit, and then they are then everyone idolizes them and says gangsters are great. So what we have is a system that idolizes gangsters and then argues that they are the better option to the police.
Right.
That's what's going on. So the middle class basically is still with the system. They're trying to bring everybody up through that system by using political power and manipulative forces. But the lower classes have basically bought into the alternative shadow government.
Right, because they have no choice. Yeah, that's how it goes.
Yeah. And so, and basically in the last several years, the middle class had a big windfall. If you survived the pandemic, you had extra unemployment. And by the way, not everyone qualifies for unemployment. And the richer, the higher your wages, the bigger your unemployment check is. So if you got laid off from your 6-figure office job, you had a hell of a year. You basically had $600 a week plus your regular unemployment, which is almost like an average of $4,000 to $5,000 a month, an unprecedentedly large check. A huge check. So that's $2,400 a month. You're essentially getting an extra bonus plus the norm. Okay. Meanwhile, the proposals for the underclass to have $1,000 a month or $2,000 a month, that got shot down. What the underclass got was one little check in the mail and defunding of the police and terror and mayhem. And so basically it's middle class.
Have you, so I think this is going to be the result is a very deep impoverishment of Western countries. And this is one of the arguments of Earl Thompson that I mentioned earlier, is that so once the Soviet system collapsed, there's no more competition. And so he says we're reverting back, he says, to the system before 1820. And he said, so he wrote this in the 80s, and he says we have 2 generations where the middle class youth is going to eat up their patrimonium.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I see happening. And now, like in Europe, the average male stays home until they're 42 because they can't afford to buy a house.
It's amazing.
And so you stay with your parents because otherwise you have to pay rent. And without rent, you can still have a good life, but you're not building anything. You're not going to own any house except if you have a patrimonium for your parents.
I'll tell you what, though, and a lot of these parents are miserable too because they feel.
And if you haven't, you go to the precariat.
So you in the United States, same thing. You had, again, this is more like the boomers really, but basically a huge economic windfall for that generation. But then they resent it because they have to, they keep thinking, oh, I'm going to have a wonderful retirement. I'm going to have great vacations. I finally am going to get to enjoy all this wealth that I was inherited. And then all of a sudden you have to spend it all on your children and your grandchildren.
So now Italy is the country, I forgot the exact figures, but where the most is, they have the record of people who can no longer go on holidays. They just can't afford to go on a holiday. So maybe we should wrap up the recorded part, because I just want we'll get some news from you as well. Have you ever seen Kensington Street? It's called Streets of Philadelphia. Kensington Street.
I'm from the area. I've been to the drug blocks in Kensington. When I was younger, I've been there.
I'm in absolute shock because I went to Boston about 7 years ago. Went through Boston Commons, and I saw like insufferably desperate people there. And so to see this block, Kensington Street, and then all the streets that on both sides of it, and then this guy's driving around for like 35 minutes without even finishing his tour. That's worse than in the 70s. I've never seen anything remotely like it.
Northern England is just as bad.
Yeah.
I've have friends from Northern England. One of my friends came from Bradford, England, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And he said it's absolutely horrible. 2 out of 3. So 2 out of 3 households are one parent households,
Right.
you know, typically, you know, mother. And the permanent depression in the labor force, and the addiction rate is like 30 to 40%. And when I say addiction, I mean hard drugs. So we're talking about heroin, meth, you know, basically, or serious alcoholism, something of that nature. Close to 40% among the average adult population in these places. There's nothing else to do but drugs. And so that's true in a lot of these old Rust Belt cities in the United States and Northern England and so forth. And that's why Bernie Sanders and politicians like that are compelling, because you go to these places and you're like, well, we've got to create jobs. This is stupid. Like, you know, so taking it full circle to where we started, I think the economic arguments are the easier ones to make to people, is to say, we need employment, we need jobs, we need, you know, affluence, we need to work well on the environment. But what we have is this cultural crisis. And I believe that was almost, this is a lot of the people who complain about neoliberalism say they were suspicious from the beginning that the neoliberal game was to try to find a way to keep growth going as well as it could, while telling people that we, instead of like fixing society for all, we will let more of the minorities into the higher classes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. It's a new social compact where, you know, so if you think about this way, right? So the labor movement became hegemonic after World War II. You know, because you had people in arms who had given their lives in the war, you know, came back home very self-confident. You had the Soviet Union as a, you know, a fear factor. And so that's when we integrate the labor movement in the state,
right?
In Europe, at least, right? It's the social contract, is the welfare state. And in '68, you have a double revolt of the young workers who no longer want to work in Fordist environments. They just don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
So you have millions of workers on the street in France and in Italy. And then you had the young students, right? And that's when they decide, and there's very good documentation on this, is like, okay, these are our children. We're going to give them what they want. So cultural rights.
Right.
But we can't afford a compromise with the working class. So we're going to deindustrialize to cheap countries. We're going to destroy the unions over time. And so this is and so then what you have is the first wave of identity politics. The women's movement, the gay movement, and, you know, and they get what they want eventually. I mean, in terms of legal rights and equality. And, you know, I'm not sure exactly how the shift happened, but so the new identity politics, the separatist, segregationist, racialist, hierarchical, you know, woke ideology. So this is a new social contract. Like, you know, we'll give you part of the cake. So we diversify the second layer, right? You have the 1%. This is for the 20%.
Right.
And we diversify
the middle,
that layer,
the
but
middle
at
class.
the cost of the underclass and the middle class under that.
Right.
And so I think that is a bit what is happening today. It's I don't think it's going to work, but that is what is behind the change. And I also think there is a deep crisis of legitimacy, right? So if you think about the end of the Soviet Union, you know, in '88, nobody thought the system would collapse. Everyone was talking about reforming, but there was such a loss of legitimacy in the ruling class that, you know, they just gave in and eventually collapsed.
Right.
And so one of the reasons you see today leaderships are just collapsing and giving in to all these demands.
Mhm.
And that for me is a lack of legitimacy. It's like they just give in because they don't know how to answer it. There's no ideology. So if you look at the left as the cultural elite, right, the not necessarily the rich, but the culturally educated, and they get their positions in all the institutions, they make their careers in universities and hospitals and all the institutions of modern life. I was going to say something. I lost my thread here. But they're all my friends are shifting to the woke position. So that the immune system, the immune system of the cultural left is not able to resist. There's no narrative that resists this very rapid cultural shift.
Yeah, this is how it often works. Now, just to wrap this up, you and I have talked about sort of like a moral revolutions, or basically what you'd say is like sort of religious revivalism and things like that.
Right.
And so the typically would say it would be a spiritual or religious movement, but you could also just say moral, because it's not always necessarily based on like esoteric explanations or based on theological explanations, but basically the problem with moral revolutions is that they always delude themselves into believing nothing like this has ever happened before.
Right.
This is the first time in the world we've ever been in this moral revolution, or that we've ever faced these existential problems. They always want to compel it with, there's no time. We've never been here before. We're the heroes of history.
Right.
And that the new terror is standing against progress, basically that even if even if I don't like the means by which we're doing this, I can offer an alternative that can keep the tide from flowing the way it's going. And so the woke tide is very much one of these moral revolutions. By the way, as I keep pointing out, you can go all the way back to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and there were periods of history where they had very similar moral tides in their principles. The Athenian revolution that brought upon the mob rule, where back in Athens, you could basically write an anonymous complaint about anyone you wanted. I forget the name of it, but there's like this wall, and you put your complaint in the wall. And so basically, like, and if you had enough complaints, if you had a preponderance of argument, it didn't have to have any fact to it. You could basically do damage to any individual you want. You could basically destroy a person just by
saying the social media.
They had social media. So
of course.
They had some. So this is what we can. So, we've never been here before. Social media is so new. You know what a meme is? It's a political cartoon that's in an open format so that anybody can use the same format and it's understandable. So basically we had that, okay? And if you go all the way back to ancient Rome, we had memes in graffiti form, open format graffiti that would use mythic little symbol, like everyone knows the basic Roman myths, right? Because you're in Roman society. And so the symbols that you would draw to make cartoons on the walls of the city of Rome were memes, because they basically borrowed from the popular stories, and they were humorous. They were almost always humorous. Political cartoons are always driven by humor, no matter what position they're pointing off. And what they do is they play upon generating cultural unity by using united symbols. You know the symbols, I know the symbols, we all know the symbols. Therefore, we've got a shared culture. And so there were meme wars taking place on the streets of Rome, and rich people used to pay. It was a very big business. They would pay, poor people from the underclass, look, have a denarii. I want you to go and create these memes all the way up and down the street, making fun of Caesar, you know. And so like you watch the TV shows, the HBO series Rome, they even show at one point where, you know, Adia was paying her servants to run a meme campaign all over the streets to disgrace her rival, you know. And so,
Yeah.
oh, it's all new. No,
Yeah.
Alexander Bard and I have basically been saying that every one of these mechanisms that we've seen in terms of the wokeism and the cultural revolution and the current generation and the meme wars and the culture wars, there are parallels running to the dawn of history where we have seen
It's
the same
it's
human
cyclic
behavior, slightly different technology.
Right. All right. So that was a good riffing.
Yeah. So to conclude, so just to conclude that, I think we did a really good coverage of the whole idea of like cultural revolution and political revolution, how they're the same, how they're different, because we kind of talked about the differences there. You know, cultural revolutions are driven by informal influence, and whereas political revolutions are driven by formal influence and the change of laws and the pursuit of new laws. And so the main difference there is just simply the mechanisms. So there's an interlocking relationship between them. Sometimes they diverge, sometimes they converge. And whenever they converge and you have a political and cultural revolution simultaneously, things get really intense.
Well,
And
this is what is, I think, a bit different from, you know, from the past, and is related to technology. It's speed, right?
Yeah.
Because so if some I'm
speed
reading
and coverage, scale.
So if you want to understand the woke hegemony, you know, I recommend maybe 3 books. So the first one is Cynical Theories, which tells you how it started in academia. So you have the 3 phases of postmodernism: deconstruction, what he calls applied postmodernism, and reified postmodernism, when they re-essentialize all the things that weren't supposed to essentialize.
Right.
And so, but that's the professorate, right? And then there's I think her name is Twenge. She identified the generation born in 95 that was in the teenage years in 2007 when the iPhone got introduced, and they socialize through social media. So their personas are extremely sensitive to opinions of other people. And they entered the university in 2013. And that's when the situation changed from being, you know, the diversity ideology, which was pushed by the management, to the trigger warning demands and the platforming and the safe space demands demanded by the students.
That's right.
Right. And so that's very well described in The Coddling of the American Mind. So that's phase 2. And then you read the Madness of Crowds of Douglas Murray, and he describes what happens when these people get jobs. Right. But so the thing that is interesting to me is the speed of it all. Like, you have an extraordinarily rapid change in institutional, especially Anglo-Saxon institutions, you know, changing their rules, changing their constitutions to this ideology in like 5 years. And that's very, very fast. So that's kind of, I think, related to the speed of technology. And I have to find a reference, but I've read that, you know, some social scientists believe that the speed of knowledge is like 8-fold now compared to 30 years ago. So if you have something new, the time you need for everybody getting it, right, has been compressed by a factor 8. You could take, for example, the IEDs, how long it took for the Taliban in the 70s or 80s to learn how to do this. And it took several years. Now, if you have a civil conflict starting anywhere in the world, you know, it will take them about 6 weeks. So the learning, the collective learning has gone like on steroids. And that's, I think, an important change.
Well, yeah, it's the mass mobilization speed that basically we do things at scale which is why it's so fast, because that's really what it's all about. How long does it take you to raise your armies? Well, that's a scale issue. It's how well do you
It's a swarming, it's a swarming effect.
Right. Well, anyway, instead of we've already done an hour and 15 minutes at this point, I think. So that was fun. I'm gonna close it here. I'm gonna say the real, meat of this analysis was talking about the interrelationship between, again, politics and geopolitics versus culture and moral shifts. And the punchline was meant to be that we do see change, and we do go through paradigm shifts, and we do see cycles, and we do see phases. But I don't want to, I think we overstress the possibility of this sort of like mass enlightenment, or sort of like this going someplace we've never gone before socially.
Well, let's keep that for the next conversation, because I would actually make the point that there are mutations. There are periods in history where
history runs forward. It doesn't run backward.
Yeah, exactly. when you have whole sets of institutions which no longer work. Think about the Reformation and the Catholic Church and the printing press, and suddenly you have the nation states which didn't exist before, right? And then 1914,
I mean, history runs forward.
All the imperial institutions collapse.
Right.
So I think next time we can talk about.
We shouldn't overstress, is what I'm saying.
I
generational consciousness raising, and because much of that consciousness raising is actually technology based. As this is what Bart and I have been talking about. Most of it is the accumulation of knowledge and the accumulation of technology, but individually humanity is becoming, if anything, weaker and more dependent on that accumulation. And that means that we're not necessarily progressing on an individual consciousness level. We're just simply starting at a higher place in terms of our accumulated knowledge.
Right. And I can understand these arguments, and maybe as you get older, I get a bit more conservative about like there are a lot of things that have to change, but there are also things we need to preserve.
Well, it's a long view. It's not necessarily classic conservatism as much as it is a long view, forces you to be more skeptical of hasty change.
And in order to change something, you need at least functional equivalence.
Right.
So you need an institution that is able to do what the old one did, maybe in a new way, but it has to be working. You can't just invent. Like that's what the Russians learned after 9/17. You can't just invent, new institutions just by fiat. That doesn't work like that. All right. I just want to, I just ask a few personal questions after the recording.
All right. Turning it off now. All right. Bye.
Yeah.